Welcome to American Chronicles. Before you step further, understand this. What you are about to see, read, and hear is not the America you were taught in school. History, as you know it, is incomplete. Some pages were deliberately erased. Some events were buried under soil and stone, hidden behind locked doors in archives you were never meant to find. Tonight, you will enter the world of secrets that were too dangerous, too mysterious, or too inconvenient to exist in textbooks. Once these stories unfold, you may never look at maps, monuments, or even familiar landscapes the same way again. If you are ready to follow the truth, then subscribe, like, and share this journey with others brave enough to see beyond the surface. Comment below your thoughts and fears, because your curiosity is the first key to what lies ahead. Remember, curiosity may awaken questions you cannot answer, but some answers demand to be heard. This is American Chronicles.
If you were to stand in the middle of the bustling streets of New York City today, surrounded by skyscrapers and neon lights, it would be nearly impossible to imagine that 1,000 years before America was even a concept, another world-shaking empire existed across the ocean. An empire so vast, so advanced, and yet so fragile that its downfall would alter the course of history forever. This is not the story of Rome, though Rome casts a long shadow here, nor is it the tale of Greece, whose philosophers still echo in classrooms. No, this is the story of the Byzantine Empire, the last guardian of the ancient world, the bridge between East and West, and a civilization whose triumphs and tragedies remain one of history's greatest paradoxes. The Byzantines, heirs of Rome, yet strangers to it, built glittering cities where golden mosaics shimmered like starlight. They pioneered hospitals, diplomacy, and military engineering centuries ahead of their time. Their capital, Constantinople, stood like a jewel at the crossroads of continents, where merchants from China, India, Africa, and Europe traded silk, spices, and secrets. And yet, despite their brilliance, despite their walls of stone and fleets of warships, this empire would eventually collapse, not because of weakness, but because of too much strength, too much wealth, too much to lose. This is a true story of emperors who blinded their brothers, of generals who betrayed their own armies, of women who ruled from the shadows, and of a city so magnificent that when the Crusaders first saw it in 1204, they wept in awe before burning it to ashes. It begins, fittingly, with fire.
The survival of Constantinople was not a miracle of faith alone. It was a miracle of engineering. Stretching across the land walls of the city were the Theodosian walls, a triple line of defenses so formidable that they stood for over 1,000 years. No enemy, no matter how vast their army, could breach them for centuries. The first wall was a deep moat, the second a towering stone barrier with battlements, and the third a colossal wall rising nearly 40 feet high. When Attila the Hun's hordes thundered across Europe in the 5th century, they shattered kingdoms and crushed armies like twigs, yet when they reached the walls of Constantinople, they halted. The greatest conqueror of his age looked at the stone giant and turned away. But stone alone could not save Byzantium. The empire also possessed a weapon that seemed stolen from the gods: Greek fire. Imagine a weapon that could not be extinguished by water, that clung to ships and men alike, burning even as it floated on the sea. When the Arab fleet surrounded Constantinople in 717, intent on bringing Islam's banner into Europe, the Byzantines unleashed this fire. Witnesses described the sea itself erupting into flame, ships swallowed in roaring infernos, sailors leaping into the waves only to burn alive upon the water's surface. The Arabs fled, their invasion broken not by swords or spears, but by this terrifying secret weapon. To this day, historians do not know the exact formula of Greek fire. It was a state secret so guarded that it vanished with the empire itself. And so through fire and stone, Constantinople endured. But survival came at a cost.
Unlike the emperors of Rome, who often left power to bloodlines, the Byzantine throne was a prize fought over in shadows and back rooms. To be emperor was to wear a crown of thorns wrapped in gold. One day you might sit in the great palace drinking wine from jewel-encrusted goblets. The next, you could be dragged to a monastery, your eyes gouged out so you could never rule again. The Byzantines believed that an emperor must be physically whole to rule. This led to a brutal practice. If a rival seized the throne, they rarely killed their predecessor outright. Instead, they blinded him, cut off his nose, or mutilated him in some way, ensuring he lived powerless, humiliated, and a warning to others. And yet, despite this cruelty, the Byzantine court produced some of the most brilliant rulers of the Middle Ages. Justinian I, for example, sought to restore the Roman Empire in the 6th century. From Constantinople, he launched wars that reclaimed Italy and North Africa, codified Roman law into the foundation of modern legal systems, and built the greatest church in Christendom, Hagia Sophia, a dome of shimmering light that seemed to float upon the air. But even as emperors built, they also burned. During Justinian's reign, Constantinople itself erupted in the Nika riots, a week of chaos where angry factions turned the city into a battlefield. Over 30,000 people were slaughtered in the Hippodrome, the great arena where once they had only cheered chariot races. Byzantium, it seemed, always stood on a knife's edge between brilliance and ruin.
Not all of Constantinople's defenders were born within its walls. Some came from the cold, harsh lands of the north, men whose names would echo in both European sagas and Byzantine chronicles. They were the Varangians, a band of Viking mercenaries who found their way to the glittering city by way of the rivers of Russia. These were no ordinary warriors. They were giants by Byzantine standards, broad-shouldered, wild-haired, their axes so heavy that ordinary men could barely lift them. The Byzantine emperors, weary of betrayal by their own generals, found a strange comfort in these northern raiders. Unlike the scheming nobles of the empire, the Varangians knew nothing of politics. They valued gold, honor, and loyalty to the one who paid them. Thus was born the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of bodyguards sworn to the emperor himself. Their reputation was terrifying. In battle, they hacked through armored knights as if they were cutting firewood. In the palace, their mere presence silenced conspiracies. So trusted were they that emperors kept the treasury under their watch, and when foreign ambassadors came to court, they often whispered in awe of the towering axe-bearing giants who stood beside the emperor's throne. One Varangian in particular would later become legendary, Harold Hardrada, who served in Constantinople before returning to the north to claim his own crown. Americans who know their history of England will recognize his name. Harold was the last great Viking king, whose death in 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge paved the way for the Norman conquest of England. But before all that, Harold had stood in the marble halls of Constantinople, a Viking sworn to a Roman emperor. The Varangians drank deep,
fought hard, and left behind runic carvings in the city that can still be seen today. Graffiti scratched by Norse hands in the great church of Hagia Sophia. Proof that even in the heart of Byzantium, the echoes of the Viking world could be heard.
For all its soldiers and walls, the Byzantine Empire survived as much through diplomacy as through war. If the Romans had once conquered with legions, the Byzantines conquered with gold, spies, and marriage alliances. Foreign kings were dazzled with jewels and silk robes. Enemy chieftains were quietly paid to attack someone else. Rival claimants to foreign thrones were smuggled money and weapons in exchange for promises of loyalty. Byzantium became the spider at the center of a vast web, pulling strings across Europe and Asia. The emperors even weaponized religion. Missionaries were sent north to convert the Slavs, bringing with them not only the Christian faith, but also a new alphabet, Cyrillic, which still shapes Russian language today. Thus, entire nations were bound spiritually and culturally to Constantinople. But every web has its flaws. The more Byzantium interfered in foreign lands, the more resentment it bred. Western Europeans especially began to view the empire with suspicion. To them, the Byzantines seemed effeminate, treacherous, and arrogant, too clever by half, too proud of their wealth. That resentment would one day come back to Constantinople in fire and steel.
By the 11th century, the empire was at its height. Hagia Sophia gleamed, trade poured in from the Silk Road, and the Varangians still guarded the throne. But beyond the horizon, new powers were rising. The Seljuk Turks, fierce horsemen from Central Asia, began sweeping westward, taking ancient lands from the Byzantines. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the unthinkable happened. The Byzantine army was destroyed, its emperor captured. The empire did not collapse, but it was broken. The Turks flooded into Anatolia, the heartland of Byzantium, seizing city after city. What had once been the empire's richest provinces were suddenly lost. Desperate, the emperor in Constantinople sent a plea for help. He did not know it at the time, but this plea would unleash one of the most astonishing and tragic chapters in world history. It would bring the Crusaders.
The year was 1095. From the hills of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II called upon the knights of Europe to march east. The Holy Land, he declared, was in the hands of the infidels. It was the duty of every Christian warrior to take up the cross, to free Jerusalem, and to win salvation through the sword. For Byzantium, this seemed like a godsend. The empire had begged for reinforcements against the Turks, and now armies of the West were on the move. But the Crusaders were not like the disciplined mercenaries or diplomats Byzantium was used to. They were hungry, proud, and violent. Men who thought nothing of looting a city, even if it belonged to fellow Christians. Still, when the First Crusade reached Constantinople in 1097, the Emperor Alexios Komnenos welcomed them cautiously. He ferried them across the Bosporus, hoping to reclaim lost lands. Against all odds, the Crusaders stormed through Anatolia, carved their way into the Holy Land, and by 1099 had seized Jerusalem itself. For a moment, it seemed the gamble had worked. But the alliance between Byzantium and the Crusaders was uneasy, built on mistrust and misunderstanding. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as rough barbarians, loud, dirty, greedy. The Crusaders, in turn, saw Byzantines as soft, scheming, and unmanly. The poison of suspicion grew. By the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the unthinkable happened.
Instead of marching to the Holy Land, the Crusaders turned their swords on Constantinople itself. On a cold April morning, the greatest Christian city in the world was attacked by men who claimed to fight for Christ. The Crusaders scaled the walls, stormed through the gates, and for 3 days unleashed a nightmare. Churches were stripped of gold and jewels. The Hagia Sophia, where emperors had been crowned for centuries, was desecrated, its sacred altar smashed, its chalices stolen. Priests were beaten, nuns violated, ancient manuscripts burned in the streets. Statues that had stood since the days of ancient Greece were melted down for coins. One chronicler wrote that the sack of Constantinople by Christians was worse than anything the Muslims had ever done. The empire never fully recovered. What had been the richest city in Europe was left a hollow shell. The Crusaders carved up Byzantine lands for themselves, and for half a century, Constantinople was ruled not by Romans, but by Latin knights. The betrayal cut deep. From that day on, the division between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism was sealed in blood. And yet, against all odds, Byzantium survived. In 1261, the Greeks retook Constantinople, restoring the empire. But it was a shadow of its former self, weakened, humiliated, and surrounded by enemies.
The last 2 centuries of Byzantium were like a candle burning low, flickering, stubborn, refusing to die, even as the darkness closed in. The empire had once stretched across the Mediterranean. Now it was little more than Constantinople and a scattering of territories. The emperors, dressed still in gold and crowned with jewels, presided over empty coffers and desperate diplomacy. To survive, they played every card: alliances with Venice, marriages to foreign princes, treaties with Turks. But every deal seemed to come at a higher cost. Piece by piece, the empire's lands were swallowed up. And then came the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans were not like the Seljuks of before. They were disciplined, ambitious, and relentless. They built a state that grew like wildfire, conquering city after city, province after province, until only Constantinople remained. For nearly a century, the city endured as an island of Byzantium in a Turkish sea. Its emperor sent desperate letters to the kings of Europe, begging for help. Sometimes soldiers came, sometimes gold, but never enough. The stage was set for the final act.
The dawn of May 29, 1453, came with the sound of drums. For 53 days, the armies of Sultan Mehmed II had surrounded Constantinople. His camp stretched across the horizon, a sea of tents, banners, and men, more than 80,000 strong. Cannons, the likes of which the world had never seen, thundered day and night, shaking the walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Inside the city, the defenders numbered fewer than 7,000. Greeks, a handful of Italians, and mercenaries stood on the ancient Theodosian walls. They were outnumbered more than 10 to 1, but their leader, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, refused to surrender. Constantine was no ordinary monarch. He was a man who knew he was doomed, yet chose to fight to the death rather than abandon the last fragment of Rome. On the night before the final assault, he gathered his soldiers in Hagia Sophia. By candlelight, he gave his last speech. "My brothers, my friends, we have reached the final hour. Remember that we are the heirs of the Romans, the guardians of Christ's church, and the last defense of our city. Today we fight not only for walls and stones, but for our faith, our children, and our honor.
Men wept as they embraced one another, knowing many would not live to see another sunrise. The assault. At first light, the Ottoman army advanced. Waves of soldiers crashed against the walls, first the irregulars, then the hardened janissaries. The defenders rained arrows, stones, and fire upon them, filling the air with screams. But the cannons had done their work. The walls that had once repelled Huns, Persians, Arabs, and Crusaders were crumbling. Gaping holes yawned where towers had once stood. Through one such breach, the Ottomans surged forward. The Italians, led by the brave Giovanni Giustiniani, held them back with desperate ferocity. But Giustiniani was struck by a bullet and carried away, his men's morale collapsing with him. In that moment, the tide turned.
The fall of the last emperor. Emperor Constantine XI, clad in armor but stripped of all royal insignia, threw himself into the fray. He was seen fighting shoulder to shoulder with common soldiers, striking down enemies with his sword. Then, suddenly, he vanished. His body was never found. Legend says that an angel carried him into the walls of Constantinople, where he sleeps until the city is free again. Others believe he fell where he stood, buried beneath the tide of Ottoman steel. By noon, the banner of the crescent moon rose above the city. Constantinople, the queen of cities, had fallen. Aftermath. Mehmed II, only 21 years old, rode into the city on horseback. He entered Hagia Sophia, where for centuries emperors had been crowned. Instead of smashing it, he ordered it converted into a mosque. To his soldiers, he declared, "From this day, this city is mine, but let no man harm its people further. Constantinople shall be the capital of my empire." Thus ended more than 1,000 years of Byzantium. With its fall, the Middle Ages closed, and a new world began. The Ottomans now dominated the crossroads of Europe and Asia, while scholars fleeing west carried ancient manuscripts that would ignite the Renaissance. Epilogue. The Ghost of Empire. Though the empire fell, its legacy endured. Byzantine law shaped Europe. Byzantine art and architecture inspired the East and West alike. Even the idea of a Roman Empire lived on, echoing in Moscow, which would call itself the Third Rome. And yet, for all its brilliance and cruelty, for all its splendor and tragedy, the Empire of Byzantium is today half forgotten, its ruins scattered, its chronicles buried in dusty libraries. But if you walked the streets of Istanbul at dawn, when the call to prayer echoes from minarets and the sun glints off the domes of Hagia Sophia, you may still feel it, the ghost of a city that once ruled the world, and of an emperor who chose to die with his people rather than surrender his crown.
Byzantium was an empire of emperors, but behind the throne, and sometimes upon it, stood women of staggering influence. Unlike in much of medieval Europe, Byzantine empresses were not merely wives and mothers. They could be regents, conspirators, power brokers, and sometimes sovereign rulers in their own right. Empress Theodora, from the stage to the throne. In the 6th century, Justinian I ruled Byzantine, but half of his power came from his wife, Theodora. Her story was stranger than fiction. Born to a bear-keeper at the Hippodrome, she began her life as an actress. At that time, a profession considered scandalous, even immoral. Yet through her intelligence, wit, and unshakable will, she rose to become Justinian's partner and co-ruler. When riots erupted in Constantinople and Justinian considered fleeing,
It was Theodora who stood firm. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," she told him. "Better to die an emperor than live as a coward." Her courage shamed him into staying, and together they crushed the revolt. Without her, the Byzantine Empire might have ended that very day.
Empress Irene, the woman who blinded an emperor. In the 8th century, Irene of Athens seized the throne in her own name, an almost unthinkable act in a male-dominated age. To secure her power, she did something shocking. She ordered the blinding of her own son, Emperor Constantine VI, so that he could never challenge her again. Though ruthless, Irene also presided over a momentous event, the end of the First Great Schism over icons. She restored the use of holy images in churches, reversing a policy that had torn the empire apart for generations. To the Orthodox faithful, she was a savior. To her enemies, a monster. The poison and the veil. Byzantine history is filled with whispers of empresses who wielded poisons, manipulated marriages, or cloaked themselves in piety while ruling with iron hands. Foreign ambassadors often remarked with astonishment that in Constantinople, unlike anywhere else, a woman could dictate the fate of armies and empires.
Long before the Black Death ravaged Europe, Constantinople was struck by a pandemic that nearly ended the empire. In 541 CE, during the reign of Justinian, a strange sickness spread from Egypt across the Mediterranean. Victims developed fevers, swollen buboes, and fell into delirium. Within days, they were dead. The Plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, was the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague. Chroniclers wrote that 10,000 people died every day in Constantinople. The streets filled with corpses, carts of dead lined the avenues, and even the emperor himself caught the disease, though he survived. Some historians believe this plague killed as much as half the population of the empire. It crippled Justinian's dreams of reconquering the West and may have shifted the balance of power in the entire Mediterranean. When Americans learn about pandemics, they often think of 1918 or COVID-19. Few realize that Byzantium faced such horrors 1,500 years earlier and barely survived.
Even centuries after it was last used, the weapon known as Greek fire remained the empire's most mysterious secret. Described as a liquid flame hurled from siphons mounted on ships, it clung to flesh and wood, igniting on contact. Water only spread it further. The recipe was so closely guarded that even modern science cannot fully replicate it. Some theories suggest it was a mix of petroleum, sulfur, and quicklime. Others think it required ingredients now lost to history. What is certain is this: Greek fire saved Constantinople more than once. When Arab fleets surrounded the city in the 7th century, this burning liquid turned the tide, engulfing entire armadas in flame. The Byzantines treated it as a divine gift. To lose the secret would be to lose God's protection. And indeed, when the secret finally disappeared, so too did the empire's invincibility.
To understand the Byzantine soul, you must imagine the roar of the Hippodrome. It was not just the stadium, it was the beating heart of Constantinople. Tens of thousands crowded into its marble seats, banners of green and blue fluttering above them. These were not just sports teams, they were factions, political movements, gangs of men who would kill for their colors. Chariot racing was the empire's obsession. Horses thundered around the track, drivers clinging to their reins, while the crowd screamed for victory. A race could spark riots, and a riot could topple emperors. The most infamous was the Nika Revolt of 532. The people of Constantinople, furious with Emperor Justinian over taxes and corruption, united under the cry, Nika, victory. What began as a riot in the Hippodrome grew into a full-blown uprising. For days, the city burned. Justinian was ready to flee, but Theodora, his empress, stood firm. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss, she declared. Inspired by her, Justinian unleashed his general, Belisarius, who stormed the Hippodrome with soldiers. By the end, 30,000 citizens lay dead, slaughtered where they had once cheered their favorite charioteers. The Hippodrome never lost its power. Foreign visitors wrote that Byzantines lived for two things: bread and races, and sometimes blood.
Beyond the politics and splendor, Byzantium was also a land of rich flavors and exotic foods, thanks to its place at the crossroads of trade. The wealthy dined on roasted lamb, spiced with cinnamon and cloves, sweet pastries dripping with honey, and fruits from as far as India. Wine flowed freely, often mixed with herbs. For ordinary citizens, bread was life. Bakeries lined the streets of Constantinople, and riots sometimes broke out when prices rose. Fish, olives, and cheese filled the diets of commoners, while spices from the east added touches of luxury when they could afford it. The empire's kitchens gave rise to dishes still familiar today, like baklava, stuffed grape leaves, and even versions of pizza like flatbreads. To eat at a Byzantine banquet was to taste the world, Asia, Africa, and Europe, all on a single table.
In an age when much of Europe relied on folk cures and superstition, Byzantium kept alive the medical knowledge of the Greeks and Romans. Doctors studied the works of Hippocrates and Galen, preserved in libraries that the West had long forgotten. Hospitals, funded by emperors and the church, were open to the public, something unheard of in medieval Europe. Yet medicine was never free from faith. Patients were treated with herbs and surgery, but also with holy water and prayers to saints. Physicians might prescribe a poultice for a wound in the morning and advise a pilgrimage to a relic in the afternoon. One of the strangest practices was the use of healing chains hung in churches, iron chains said to cure madness when wrapped around the afflicted. Byzantium walked the line between science and miracle, reason and faith, and in doing so, it kept alive knowledge that would later fuel the medical revolutions of the Renaissance. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel. This is a boring history for sleep. Good night.